part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sabol Brothers on the Baseline Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Sabol.
And I'm John Sabol. Thanks for tuning in.
So if you are a Cleveland sports fan, and if you are a person who collects books, if you have read, I know I'm sounding old here, but newspapers or articles online, anything about Cleveland sports in the last, a couple of generations, then you have probably either heard of this gentleman or you have read his material. Joining us today is none other than Terry Pluto.
Yeah, Terry Pluto, a prominent writer in the Cleveland, Akron area here in northeastern Ohio. Used to write for the Akron Beacon Journal, Cleveland Plain Dealer, written a ton of books about anything you name it, from the Cavs, the Indians to the Browns. A wealth of knowledge, a lot of historical books of the past. He also used to be a columnist and then, had beats back in the day too. We're going to hopefully touch on, Scott, his beat of the Cavaliers and those glory years of the late 80s, early 90s. Just a guy who knows pretty much everything when it comes to, Cleveland sports from the 70s on to today.
Exactly. It'll be interesting too to talk with him about how he gets started writing books. When you have an idea, okay, great. We all have ideas, but how do you take that idea and how do you take it forward? This is going to be a fun conversation, and I'm sure he's going to give us enough information for multiple podcasts, and we'll try to keep it as streamlined as we can.
Sounds good. Let's take a break right here, Scott. And joining us after the break, the legendary Cleveland, Akron writer, Terry Pluto.
Hey everyone, this is Mike Voorhees.
And I'm Brian Shaw. No, not the pitcher. We're the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast, formerly a Swinging a Tribe.
Don't have time to watch 162 games of baseball? We do. We have you covered with recaps of the games, stats, and analysis throughout the MLB season.
Subscribe now to Guardians of the Land and Press Play Pods for all your Cleveland sports analysis.
Hey everyone, I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Jeremy Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need each week to get you ready for kickoff and beyond.
Don't miss our breakdowns of each week's matchups, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we all know, Holly, dogs got to eat.
That's right, Jeremy. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Our guest today is longtime Northeastern Ohio sports writer. He's written for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Akron Beacon Journal. Now he writes for Cleveland.com. He has authored and co-authored more than 30 books. Joining us today is none other than Terry Pluto. Terry, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well.
So Terry, before we jump into the whole Cleveland sports scene, and it's something that I've always wondered, especially people who write books and do it for a living and have done it a lot, is what's your process? How do you start? You have an idea, and then how do you get that process going? And where's a good place for you to write? Is there a specific room you like to write in? How does that work?
Well, a friend of mine is a pastor, Ronald Fowler of an African-American church in Akron, and he's retired. And he said when he was a young pastor, he said to one of his mentors, he said, well, how many points should a good sermon have? And his mentor said, well, one would be a good idea. And it's kind of the same thing about a book. And if you think about, I kind of created this thing, think about like a bicycle wheel, how you have a little thing in the center, and then you have all these spokes going off of it to a bigger wheel. Well, the center should be your idea, and every spoke should be able to keep the wheel turning around. Because if it doesn't, then it's like, you get a clunky ride or no ride at all. So that's part of it. it's like, okay, I'm going to write something about the Browns. Now, I cheat a lot. So like if I do a vintage Browns or vintage Cavs, that just means I'm just going to write about interesting things I think about those teams or different people. It isn't like a definitive history or anything. Like when I did a book called The Comeback on LeBron James, which I was working on before they won the title in 2016. It was designed to talk about what happened after LeBron left, the rebuilding process, him coming back, all the front office machination. The idea was like take you inside the front office to say that was the idea, not knowing, I knew they were going to be good with LeBron, but not knowing they were going to win a title with him. Mm-hmm. So that was, that's kind of how it is. You really do have to have an idea, as they say, one good point is a good place to start. And writing a lot because I write so much for the paper that I'm able to, whether it's recycle or expand on a lot of those themes, but it also allows me to be in good position to interview people because they know me from my daily job. Mm-hmm. That's a big part of it too. Do they know you? Will they talk to you? And when you've been in a market a long time, they know your goal is not to, get ahead and have it posted on a stick and say, well, I got that guy, I stuck it to him. You really do a lot of like relationships and that, come into play. But the main thing I would say about the best people, whether they're in broadcasting or in sports, and I'm thinking about like Joe Tait, I was very close friends with, and that they would say, Joe Tait loved broadcasting and liked sports. Mm-hmm. And that tends to be the best play-by-play people. They may love doing baseball, but they love the broadcast more than they love the sport. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing in writing. You better love to write if you want to be a sports writer. In fact, sometimes I love sports and I know all the stats. It's like, well, please don't just, inflict that on the reader. You have to tell a story. And that's what I like to do. I like to write.
Let's start out. How did your career start? Let's take us back to the beginning. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
By the time I was in high school, I did, because I had an English teacher there at Cleveland Benedictine named Jim Youth in ninth grade honors English. He liked some stuff I wrote. He kind of convinced me to join the school paper. And I found suddenly that even though I was a terrible athlete on these teams, that some of the people that when I'd write a story in the school paper, some of the stars actually wanted to read it. I thought, oh, that's cool. They don't even know my name and I'm on the team. And they cared about that. Bit of an exaggeration, but not by much. And I found it was nice to find something you're good at. It's hard enough in life to find one thing you can do. And if you do it and then you can learn to love it, success helps you. So that was it. But I mean, I grew up in a house where I've already written more books than were in my house growing up. Mm-hmm. My parents were, my grandparents on both sides came from Slovakia. My parents were the first, generation here living on the east side of Cleveland, and they had papers all the time, but they did not, I don't even remember them reading a book. I really mean that. But they read the paper. Now my mother got books from the library, read them to me as a kid, but it's not like a Roger Connor or Boys of Summer, and he had all these stories of, his family sitting around reading James Joyce and all this stuff. It's like, give me a break, Mm-hmm. So, but that was, I found out I liked doing it. And so I went after it, even though a lot of people told me it was a really bad idea in the 1970s. And it's kind of like what you hear now, that back then papers were going, from 2 and 3 in a market to only 1. Television was supposed to take over everything. And what happened was the interesting development there is, these markets went from like 2 to 1 paper, but that one paper came out really strong from a business perspective for a long time. And so, I was able to kind of ride that wave.
Terry, do you have a favorite story about a specific player in your time covering all 3 teams here in the Cleveland area? Maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a front office executive.
First year covering the Cavaliers at the Beacon Journal was the last year of World Be Free with the team and with George Karl as the coach. Mm-hmm. And I got to know World very well. He was a high scoring guard for them. Mm-hmm. And this is a different era where you're allowed to watch the whole practice. There weren't that many people covering the team. You got to know them. So after practice, sometimes the sports writers would stick around and play pickup and And then other times they'd go and World would ask me, he would want to play 3-point horse, where you get a letter for each miss. And basically he would start by HORS. The idea was for me just to get one 3-point letter on him. And I bet we played a dozen times and I never did. I mean, he would have been, World Be Free in the modern NBA would have been James Harden. I mean, he would have just been this incredible score and all that. And he was just so much fun to talk to. I remember early on, he goes, "Man, Pluto, you don't know how hard it is to get 20." So 20 points. He goes, "No, man, I'm talking about get off 20 shots in an NBA game,
Yeah.
And then it sounded like he was looking for that. But then he got actually, there was something behind it. He said, "Remember, our team is not very good. So if you're playing the Cavaliers, you're thinking, I got to stop one man. I got to stop World. I can't let him get his 20 shots." Meanwhile, you were talking about himself in the third person. World's thinking, I got to get me 20 shots or we got no chance to win with these guys.
Like Ricky Henderson.
Yeah, it was kind of like that. I better get my points. And so, and it was correct. And he was just fun to be around. And I just enjoyed that. Even when the late 80s, early 90s, when Lenny Wilkins was coaching here, there were times after practice where some of the players on the bench players wanted to run full court games, and they would get sports writers like myself and Bert Gray from the Plain Dealer and some others and some PR guys. And there would be like 4 NBA players, 2 on each team and 3 of us. And we'd be playing full court. The idea being, you better get out of their way. I mean, now you would never do it. I mean, what a nightmare that would be. Somebody like I played a couple of times in the backcourt with Steve Kerr, and all Steve wanted to do was run off picks. So I'm like this, while he's being covered, and so those things where you would really get to know people. And I remember Kerr was traded to the Cavaliers after 1 year where he was stuck on the end of the bench at Phoenix. And, now we've recognized him. This guy's going to go in the Hall of Fame as a coach. But back then he was a marginal player hanging on. And we went out to lunch, and this is like right before the cut down day. And he's like, I'm going to get cut. I said, "No, you're not." And he says, "I'm going to get cut. I can feel it." I said, "No, Steve, they traded for you. Wayne Embry, the GM, and Lenny Wilkins, they love outside shooters, and you're going to make it." And he said, I said, "You know what? You're going to play 10 years in this league because it's going to go towards a 3-point thing. And when you're there for 10 years, you owe me lunch." 10 years later with the Chicago Bulls, he paid off.
No way.
Yeah, he really did. Steve is a wonderful man. And I have to admit, though, I am amazed, not that he did well in broadcasting because he could always communicate in that, but that he became such a successful coach, because it's not just that he has pretty good talent. The way the Golden State Warriors play is so counterintuitive to the NBA with all the ball movement, passing, and people movement. It's kind of like the Cavs with all their big men playing defense. But Kerr was another one that, I would see him up in the gym sometimes by himself. He would set up chairs. And it's like he's in the 3rd grade. He was dribbling around chairs because he really wanted to work on dribbling with his left hand. And he would just for 20 minutes, he'd do nothing but dribble around these chairs and practice moves on chairs. So those are things that the early days of the NBA for me, it was a lot of fun to be around. And I understand now why they've shut down a lot of access and things, because one, you didn't want to see, they don't want you to see something, maybe a fight in practice. And also there's just a lot more media around. And so that's how it is.
Yeah. I think a lot of the reason is, Terry, like these guys are, making a lot more money than they did back in those days. And your first year there was 86 that you're referring to. And there's more media. And so there's more, teams are more protective of guys than they used to be for a lot of different reasons. You mentioned playing basketball. I got to ask this question. Did you just randomly bring your sneakers in a bag knowing that you may have played?
You would. Yeah. That you could end up afterwards shooting around. Cause a lot of times we would say we want to play, Yeah. And most of the time it's just the sports writers or TV people and maybe some PR people playing. But now and then the guys wanted to, because they're not playing much on the bench, and they want to get a run in, as they would say. And so that was the idea. Yeah, you would bring that now, and then we used to play pickup on the road after shoot arounds and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
I'll tell you what's an interesting thing. If you've never shot the ball in a big arena, and I'm talking about it's the depth perception behind that glass backboard is really different. And I remember first few times playing pickup, whether it was at the Coliseum or I remember San Antonio, a couple other places. It's like I couldn't shoot anyway, but I mean, I'm not like missing the rim. It's really bad. You really had to adapt to it. When I was talking to Mark Price, he said when he made his first All-Star game in 1989, it was at the Astrodome, and he said, I never saw when they had a shoot around practice. He goes, I never saw so many great players shoot more air balls. He said, because we are not used to playing in a dome. And it just, the depth perception, even from that it was just really strange. The lighting felt weird. It's kind of like, you're no longer playing in your backyard. Now you're down at some other playground where it's a half moon metal backboard, one of those double rims that, totally unforgiving.
We're going to bounce around here on different topics. So I want to talk a little bit of Browns right now, and we'll come back to the Cavs a little bit later. The rush to get the Browns back here is well documented, Terry, back in the late 90s. And if the Browns and the NFL and the city of Cleveland had to do it all over again, they likely would have built the stadium in a new location, at least in my opinion. I know that's been talked about before. Two-part question. One, do you agree with that because all the issues at the lakefront? And then the second part of that is, what do you think the chances are that the Browns build a new stadium in the next 20 plus years somewhere else around town as a retractable dome?
Well, if you were to pick, what is a smarter investment? A baseball stadium, an arena, or a football stadium?
My opinion would be an arena first. And then a football stadium. Second? Football stadium.
I would argue football would be third, simply by a number of dates.
Yeah, that's true.
81 home games in Cleveland.
Yeah, and I guess the one flip side, Terry, would be if you have a football stadium, let's say in a dome. Let's talk about let's use the Colts for example, Lucas Oil. You're going to be having more events there.
Yeah, they're taking it away and moving it to LA.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just saying maybe I'm just kind of cynical on the football situation. I mean, my goodness, they'll move a team in a heartbeat. And to me, it's nice to have a dome for football for maybe the 5 games out of the 7 or 8 that are bad, but cost dollar wise, and besides, people are going to buy the tickets and go anyway.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're talking about baseball, an 81 game schedule, and probably 30 of those dates are going to be played in pretty iffy weather. A retractable dome makes a lot more sense in my mind for baseball, but they're not going to do it, Right. So I guess in that regard, by the way, I'm old. I don't remember things, but I do not recall any serious discussion back then of building a new stadium anywhere other than where they built the football stadium, knocking down the old one and building it up there. That's what I heard they were going to do, and that's what they did. Now, Jimmy Haslam wants to put one together somewhere else, fine, but I just would not put a ton of money into something like that, because you might get a Super Bowl, or you might get this event or that event now and then. I like, for example, you see what Rocket Mortgage Marina, that thing's hopping all the time.
Yeah.
Like you said there's always something going on. And baseball, you do have 81 home dates.
So in your Vintage Browns book, by the way, and thank you very much, because those are excellent reads, you talked about former Cleveland Brown Ernie Green, and you mentioned you dedicated a chapter there on him being the most underrated Cleveland Brown. And it's a name that, a lot of Browns fans, and I know we're going back, to the 1960s, but most people probably don't even know who this guy is. Why is he the most underrated Brown in your opinion?
Well, I just sort of picked it because 1, he wasn't a championship team. 2, he was in the backfield with Jim Brown. he really ended up being a blocking back for Jim Brown, even though Brown was much bigger and stronger. When he did carry the ball, he averaged nearly 5 yards a carry. I believe he led the 64 Browns team in touchdowns. You can win some money with that. And then after being next to Jim Brown all those years, Brown retires, and here comes Leroy Kelly. So this guy, this is back when the two-back system was really in vogue, ends up playing his entire career next to two Hall of Famers. And, the Browns of the 60s were really good, not just in 64. I mean, they were always contending. And he's such a humble guy, smart guy. He went into business, Ernie Green Industries, and he had owned different companies, multimillionaire that way. And see, that nice thing about doing like a vintage Browns, or I like him. So I thought he's one of the most underrated ever. For the like you said, most people haven't. You could look it up. And the players, I did a book called Brownstown 1964. Those guys that played with him, they absolutely just loved Ernie Green and respected him.
Is it hard to get these older players to talk? Hard to get a hold of them? And then when you get a hold of them, are these guys reluctant or are these guys really open?
The hardest thing sometimes to track them down, but no, most of them really want to talk. Especially, usually good books and that are built on not if you get a big name guy who's interviewed all the time, because he almost has a set routine that he'll talk about. It works better when you get people such as Ernie Green or Steve Kerr when he was, not a big name player, and that you get them when they haven't been interviewed lately or interviewed for years. And then it's kind of like, and a number of these guys, sometimes they moved on to other things in their life. They're glad somebody remembers them. So that's the key. And then you get people like broadcasters, assistant coaches, trainers. They tell really good stories.
Terry, when you go back in your vintage Cavs book, I love that book because, obviously I'm a big Cavs fan and Browns and Indians too, but there is something about that book that I love a lot of. You mentioned Steve Kerr, Mark Price, Joe Tait and all that. There's one story that I found fascinating, and I, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Joe Tait told this story to you in the book where he was driving to the old Cleveland Arena and almost hit Wilt Chamberlain in the street because the players had to dress, the visiting players showered and dressed across the street at the hotel because there was no hot water in the arena. And
it was so bad. Yeah, the old Cleveland Arena, they stayed, sometimes that was a Holiday Inn or something else, so they would just dress over there. And
it's a funny story.
Yeah, it just is, because it just, the humble beginnings. Like over the weekend, I wrote a thing on the Cavs All-Stars of the 70s. And, not exactly a well-known group there, where John Johnson was the first, and then Butch Beard was the second. Lenny Wilkins was the third as a player. Austin Carr had a year. Campy Russell had a year. And all those guys played, I think except Campy, played at least some games at the old Cleveland Arena, which is around the Cleveland State campus on Euclid Avenue now. But it was a dump. I mean, I went there as a kid, and they really did. Bill Fitch and Joe Tait sometimes went out and shot the big rats that hung around the back. They had Fitch had a pistol, and it was like, these things were huge. And that was where they were trying to figure out how to get a downtown arena, and where they couldn't get any. That was Cleveland in the 70s when it was really going down. The remarkable thing was the Cavs didn't move or go out of business. The NBA in the 70s was hanging by a thread in many, many markets. And so Cleveland was fortunate to get through all that. But yeah, they really did have all these rats. They had, the ice underneath the floor for hockey, and it seemed like the water would seep through it. And it really was a small circle of friends that went down to those games. And I've enjoyed doing that book because I kind of, being 66, so 1970, I was 15 when the team came, and I was so excited because I love basketball to see that. They would play exhibition games around town, like at Baldwin Wallace. They played one at Wadsworth High School that I went to.
Wow.
That was in the 80s, by the way. I was covering the team then. And it was just a smaller world, and basketball fans kind of knew each other because, like the team, there weren't as many. You hear about the 20,000 that showed up for Miracle Richfield in 1976, and they say only in Cleveland could you have a Miracle Richfield team that didn't even make the NBA Finals, but that's because I wrote about this a lot. If you're around from the old arena days to Nick Milletti having no money, to how this all could have collapsed easily, the fact that they got into a new arena in Richfield and suddenly they began to win. And by the way, now, Bill Fitch was the rookie head coach in 70, and he had a bunch of losing records early on. He never would have survived in the modern NBA. They would have fired him.
Right.
And
you mentioned Bill Fitch, and he just passed away recently. And I didn't realize, just by reading that excerpt in your book, he coached Phil Jackson.
Yes,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I coached Phil Jackson in North Dakota. He was an assistant coach. I don't think I mentioned this, at Creighton in baseball, along with being in basketball, and when Bob Gibson was there.
Really?
So the Hall of Fame pitcher. I think he caught him warming up, or he has some Bob Gibson stories. Fitch gets this job in 1970 because Nick Milletti is a Bowling Green graduate. Fitch was coaching for a year at Bowling Green. Milletti gets to know him. In fact, Milletti books a Bowling Green Niagara game at the old Cleveland Arena. This was before the NBA was moved in, and it drew very well. Niagara had a small star named Calvin Murphy at 5'7". He came in, and I remember my father taking me to that game, watching Fitch's team play Niagara. And so Milletti gets the expansion franchise in 1970. He's looking for a coach. He has no money. Nick Milletti was a master of other people's money. I mean, somehow he amassed a way of, at one point he had the Indians, he had the Cleveland Crusaders, he had the Cavaliers, and he had what is now WTAM radio. And so he goes and romances Fitch. It's like the one basketball coach he knows. He puts him in charge, not only as coaching, as the GM of the 1970 expansion team. He's hired 5 days before the college draft. And if you look at the way the Cavs drafted that year, I believe 5 or 6 of their top 10 picks, because they had a lot of picks, were all Big Ten players, because at that point Fitch was at Minnesota and he knew these Big Ten guys. And he had Street and Smith's College Basketball Magazine for a scouting thing, and he called some guys he knew and he drafted. And then when they did the NBA expansion draft after that, with players were available, they actually did use basketball cards because there was no internet. There was nothing else. And cards had pictures of guys and stats. And this never should have worked. And so really Fitch didn't know what he was doing in the NBA. And he just kind of learned as he went along. He had an owner that certainly didn't want to fire him and pay him off. And so he survived. And then eventually, he became a Hall of Fame coach. He coached 5 different teams. But it was hard to do that, just like Joe Tait, who had gotten to know Bill Fitch when Joe was a young broadcaster in college at Monmouth College, and Fitch was at Coe College, 2 small Division III schools. And Fitch would come in and be scouting football games, even when they would go across sports. And he got to know Joe in the press box because they were in the same conference. And when Fitch got that job, Joe wrote him asking for an announcing job, and they didn't want to hire anybody for any money. So they hired Joe, who was at Terre Haute at that point, for $100 a game to come in and do the games. You think about this, Joe's in the Hall of Fame as a NBA broadcaster, basketball Hall of Fame. Fitch is in the Hall of Fame as a coach. These guys, small college guys, improbable ways of getting a job. And then they become icons, especially Joe. It is, I would say a pure God thing, this is just remarkable.
Didn't Joe cut an audition up in at the arena? What was it? He had he recorded, in your book you mentioned this, he recorded like an audition. What was it? Hockey, way up in the press box somewhere?
He did. He was in the hockey press box, which was way up behind the basket, speaking into a real tape recorder for like one of the, because The
Right.
Cavs actually were having a PR guy named Bob Brown there the first couple of games because they were looking for a broadcaster. And so Fitch brought in Joe. Think about that, by the way. The coach and GM is now picking the broadcaster.
Right.
Yeah.
So he brings in Joe, sits him up there. He does a reel-to-reel tape. And I guess they get, and then Joe stayed at that same hotel across the street where you have to walk across to the arena. And make sure, by the way, that hotel sometimes had some hookers and other unsavory characters hanging over there too. It was not exactly the Ritz at Tower City. So he said he's not even sure how much Nick Maletti and Fitch even listened to that tape. He gets a call the next morning, you're hired $100 a game. And so as Joe is driving from Terre Haute to Cleveland to begin his job, the Cavs are playing in Philadelphia the next night, and he's listening to the game on the radio back when it was on one of those big booming stations out of Philly. And the Cavs are getting hammered. I mean, they were terrible. And the broadcasters were saying how this is the worst NBA team they've ever seen. It'll be a miracle if they survive the season. And Fitch was married with a couple of kids thinking, what have Tait was married with a couple of kids wondering, what have I done? And so he got in and, and it's kind of like you guys understand this from a broadcasting thing. He was just looking for any work he could do besides the Cavs. He did swap shop and I forgot what else I think he probably did the weather because, as you know, Scott, everybody can do the weather.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
So, I mean, whatever fill-in he was there for. And I love those kind of remarkable beginning stories. But the thing about Joe to remember is he's a broadcaster first.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he could give you as good a broadcast on Mount Union football or those girls' high school games that he would sometimes do,
right,
as he would on the Cavaliers or as he would on the Indians.
So I have a question about Joe, and I want to hold off the follow-up question in just a few seconds. I want to shift gears real quick. I want to talk about the Cleveland Barons. All right. So the Cleveland Barons didn't last in Cleveland, but just a couple of seasons back in the 70s for a variety of reasons. Do you think that if it were the 80s or the 90s, do you think the NHL could have worked in Cleveland, especially with the NHL taking off and you had the Wayne Gretzky's coming up? Do you think that ship sailed a long time ago and it never would have worked?
Well, the Barons were around for years as a AAA team, kind of like
AAA team, right?
Yeah. I remember as a kid, my father taking me down to the old arena. He knew a guy named John Vargo, who was the business manager for the team. And my dad would get these cheap tickets, like 3 rows behind the bench of the Barons. And we didn't really like hockey that much, but it's kind of fun to go when they were cheap and that. And that was very good hockey back then because I think there were only like 8 or 10 NHL teams, and they were a farm team for Toronto. But once the NBA came, we mentioned here on how Scott and John, there's the smallest market with 3 teams. 4 teams, I don't think so. It just would be too much. Dan Gilbert kind of props up the Monsters. They have a loyal following, but you get into now with the big leagues where you have to really pay these guys and everything else. I just don't think so. So Gilbert loves the AAA team in there because it fills up all those dates that, around the Cavs, and he has, the stuff going on in the arena. Then he fills in with the concerts, and they got something going, as I mentioned before, all the time. And that's why an arena is a great investment. But I don't see it. I know the Guns did a lot of surveys and things, the Gordon Gun, when they owned the Barons. And remember, they tried the Crusaders and the WHA, and it just didn't work.
Yeah, and I think now too, the NHL, they're looking at different markets too. I mean, if they're going to expand again, they've expanded to Las Vegas and Seattle in the last few years.
See, they're running the markets where there aren't as many teams.
Yeah, and think of Nashville. That market is huge for hockey now.
Yeah,
I've lived in Tampa since 2013 before coming back up to Cleveland recently. That's a huge hockey market. But yeah, I know it won't happen now, but it had the Barons started in the NHL, like Scott said, in maybe the 80s or 90s, I wonder if it would have stayed that way.
I don't know. I think at some point they would have run into the same problems that the teams now run into, which is that, the Browns get first pick of the corporate sponsors and that. They just get it because they're the Browns. Doesn't matter good, bad. Then the other two are kind of scrambling.
Mm-hmm.
And, the corporate sponsors and the price of running these things is higher.
Hey, Terry, I wanted to ask you, are you a sports memorabilia guy?
No.
So you don't own anything regarding and I'm not talking like a autograph picture or anything like that, but was there anything from any of the old stadiums, Municipal Stadium, the Richfield Coliseum, Cleveland Arena, anything that you took from those?
No, I got a Joe Tait and World Be Free bobblehead.
There you go.
And I got the thing I really liked. Fred McClaw's wife sent a bunch of us in media. Fred's one of Fred's ties.
Yep.
I remember that.
My bookcase over here, it's in Joe and World, the bobbleheads with the tie around it.
Oh,
that's cool.
That's it. And because one advantage, I think, to having been doing this a long time is I've enjoyed different relationships with players, although really the last 15 years, it's hard to get pretty close to most of these guys because of the way access is set up.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned before, I like sports. I love to write. So it isn't like I really idolize. Early on, I figured out that just because they're really good at whatever sport it is, it doesn't mean that they're particularly more interesting than anybody else when it comes into any other topics. And oftentimes, some of the people that I enjoy talking to the most, as I mentioned before, Steve Kerr, or I remember with the Indians, they had so many stars, but Omar Vizquel was always good to talk to, and Dennis Martinez and Oral Hershiser. But see, some of those guys are sort of at the end of their careers, that.
Right.
And they were really, it was fun, to have those relationships. But so no, I don't save enough. My wife does have, because it was a thing they gave out. She has a Carlos Carrasco jersey they gave out one time because she always liked Carrasco even before the leukemia. But then after that, the way on that. So that's like just having a jersey of a terrific guy.
Sure, absolutely. So you've written, over 30 books. Is there any big story that you have in the back of your mind that you've always wanted to write that you either haven't gotten around to, or it's something that you want to get to sooner than later? Any big, not big story, something that...
No, Scott, I wish I could tell you, but no, there isn't. Some of these books I've just done, especially like Vintage Cavs and Vintage Browns, I've been rolling around in my head. How can I write like a sport or a book about the franchise that isn't like, in 1947, a people-based human story. I remember before, I like writing, I like stories more than I like the sports. You can read Vintage Browns and really get a lot out of it, but it's not a ton of it's not about football. I mean, you get some strange stuff in there. It's like one of my favorite stories, because I never heard this, is how Marty Schottenheimer sort of was fired. The Browns had just lost a playoff game, and they were 10-6, and under 4 years under Marty, they were good every year, but they had the drive, they had the fumble, there was frustration. Art Modell wants to have this huge meeting to, get ready for next year right after the season. Schottenheimer's drained. They're arguing back and forth. Art wants Schottenheimer to fire his brother as a special teams coach and hire a different offensive coordinator. And so Marty goes in, and basically they decide to part ways. But Kevin Burney, the PR guy, comes in and says, well, what happened here? And he goes, so is Marty fired? And Marty says, yes. And Art says, I'm not firing him. And Marty says, yes, you are. He goes, well, Marty, are you resigning? No, I'm not. He goes, yes, he is. So it's like they're sitting there. And this is one of those things, if you just wait 2 weeks, you probably work through it. And, of course, Marty leaves and goes on to Kansas City and goes on to San Diego and has a stellar career, does everything but win a Super Bowl. Meanwhile, the Browns just fall off the face of the earth with that.
Right.
So that was fun. But, is it a football story? It's a people story.
Right.
It's about egos. It's about frustration. One of Kevin Burns and Ernie, of course, he was a GM back then, one of their theories was, had they just not gone through all the agony with those, had they just like lost normally, they might not have gotten to that point. And then he would have had Marty here for many. Marty was a really good coach.
Sure. You talk about interesting stories. Ron Pruitt, the former catcher for the Indians, lives right down the street from me. And he tells just an interesting story about the old stadium. They just wanted to take batting practice. And for them in the old stadium back in the day to get the equipment out, he said we had to move the brown stuff and then we had to go in here. And just to hear that it's a people story. It's a story about them struggling to take batting practice.
Well, they would along those lines too. They would, the Browns would start playing in August preseason games. And so you could still see the outline of the football field on there when Rick Manning was playing center field and they would hit a fly ball to center. He would start waving his one hand in the air like it's a fair catch, to do that. Yeah. They also used to paint the grass green there because it was over a landfill. And by then it was just starting to come up and it was a disaster. I mean, there was one ladies' room that was over the general manager's office. And sometimes the plumbing wouldn't work real well. And the GM, Phil Segi, would walk in there and let's just say his desk was a little damp.
Oh man. Man, we thought we had plumbing issues at the Brown Stadium in that Kenny Chesney concert back in the day.
Yeah. So it's just, So there were, they really desperately needed a baseball stadium. They did. And, Jacobs Field, now Progressive Field, is really still a nice ballpark. And I was glad I'd love to see a retractable roof on it, but I'm glad they're going to keep it upgraded up. It's so important to have a team here. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, there were at least 3 times these guys were on the verge of moving. At one point, they had a deal, agreed to it, a handshake, but it wasn't signed, to play 20 games in New Orleans. Hal Lebowitz, basically I kind of have Hal's job now, but he was the columnist and sports editor at the Plain Dealer back then. He heard about it and he just plastered it all over the front page, and the city people got involved and truncated that deal. But that would have been the first step to getting them out of town. Of course, they would have gone to even worse market in New Orleans.
Right.
But that was, at that point, they thought any place in the South would be a good idea because that's a growing area and Cleveland's a dying area.
Terry, what year was that?
It was the late 60s sometime.
And then eventually they just couldn't come up with the funds, or did they just decide that it was a bad move?
The city stepped in, and I think they kind of helped them a little bit. I don't remember all the details because I was just a kid. Unfortunately, the person who really knew that story well, he's no longer with us, is Les Levine, the wonderful broadcaster there, because he and Hal were extremely tight. And that's how I know it happened, because Les always told me that story.
Wow. I never knew that they almost moved, the Indians almost moved there in the 60s.
Oh, yeah, and then another time, it was very close when Peter Bavasi was running the team here in the 80s to move into to Tampa before they got
Tampa, right. I remember that.
Yeah.
There were a lot of franchises trying to move to Tampa there in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, they got a lot of stadiums built for different teams.
Yeah, they did. Chicago White Sox were one.
The
Indians, and then the Giants were another one that were that was rumored to come to.
Right.
To
and of
Tampa.
course, you go down there, and it's like got the thing on the peninsula in St. Pete, and
at least they finally scrapped that stupid sister city deal with Montreal. I grilled the owner at the time when they made that decision a couple years ago, and they debuted it, and they just killed it recently in the last month or so. Now, just hopefully they get what they need to do, and we can talk all about it all day long, Terry, but what they need to do is build that ballpark in Tampa, which I think and I hope they will end up doing once that lease is up here in a few years.
That's why you'd never want to, and to think that I'll lose the team and get one back. Well, Seattle was a great NBA city. But the ownership there didn't like the arena, moved into Oklahoma City. Seattle still doesn't have an NBA team.
And now that arena has since been completely gutted and renovated, and that's where the Kraken, the new NHL.
And it's like, so if you really want it, I would put that's a big market. I put an NBA team there in a heartbeat. Yeah. That's why we want to protect the teams that we have. That doesn't mean you just give them everything they want all the time.
Yeah.
But it's just, it's significant here.
Yeah.
Sports means more here. I would argue sports means a lot more here than like where you were in Tampa.
Oh, hands down, Terry. Yeah, absolutely. Sports is everything here. You go down south. I don't care if you're in Miami, Tampa, LA,
Atlanta,
San Diego, Atlanta. It's just not the way of life. I mean, you're in beautiful weather, so you're outside 8 months out of the year
the
anyway.
legendary Pete Franklin, who was the godfather of sports talk, told me that in Cleveland that he was here, and then he went to New York for a while, the early days of FAN. Then he went out to the Bay Area, and he said, in Cleveland, as you said, you could do Browns all the time. They're debating backup guards and all kinds of stuff,
Right.
Kickers, our obsession with kickers here along with quarterbacks. And he said, you go out to there and, the 49ers lost. I heard there's a new restaurant opening in San Francisco, or, let's go hiking. I mean, that was kind of that.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's like this transient mentality. You just hop around. You don't, there's
even
no
if you're
passion.
from California, but it's like the teams are not as, because a lot of the teams are newer, so they didn't go back 3 or 4 generations like here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, look at the Giants, look at the Dodgers, look at who else was one there? Well, Lakers.
They came in the late 50s. I mean, you didn't have that, so it's
the Rams too.
Came and left.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And also, just as you said, it's transients and it's just a different, maybe because the weather's nice or whatever. I don't know.
A 2-part Cavs question for you. You mentioned in your vintage Cavs book, Terry, that the Cavs should retire World B. Free's number because he basically saved the franchise.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they'll ever retire his number? And then also, how close are the Cavs actually moving to Toronto to become the Toronto Towers?
Well, I think that was somewhat with Ted Stepien, but I'll answer this one first. The real plan where they could have lost them was after this whole thing with Toronto fell apart, because Ted Stepien couldn't pull that off, but they were going to fold the franchise if they couldn't sell it to Gordon Gunn. They were going to fold the franchise. This is like in 1983, and they were going to combine the players with the Indiana Pacers and play in Indianapolis, because at that point it was such a disaster here. They basically begged Gordon Gunn to buy the team. Gordon Gunn owned the Coliseum, and he got the sweetheart deal to buy the team at very little cash, and also got at that point, which was somewhat lucrative, Ted Stepien, the owner, had an advertising business that did pretty well. So part of the deal was that if we take the Cavs off your hands with all the losses, then we also get the advertising business. And they did. And that saved the Cavs. And World Be Free was playing then. And, Joe and I we liked World, we enjoyed it, but it was really hard back then to sell basketball, because Stepien, not only were there terrible teams, he was a pretty loathsome figure. And if you were to go back and outline, they could do one of those Case Western Reserve Business School studies on how to wreck an NBA franchise, and they could use the Cavaliers of the early 80s and Stepien on exactly how to alienate everyone, how to do it. And so that was the bigger one, even more than Toronto, was this plan was in place. Now, maybe they figured Gordon Gunn owned the Coliseum, so what's he going to do? Just have that thing sit empty? But in fact, they allowed the Cavaliers, because all the draft choices have been traded by the Ted Stepien, Bill Musselman regime, they allowed them to buy 4 consecutive first-round draft choices the next 4 years. That was part of the deal for the Gordon Gunn to get it, so that they would be able to get some players. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was like, think about it, he gets 4 draft choices. He gets the advertising business. He gets the team for the building he already owns, because they had got it out of receivership, by the way. Gordon Gunn was a master of, they call it, getting distressed property, shall we call it. And part of his business, Gunn Investment, was then you would spiff them up and sell them. Mm-hmm. And so he looked at it that way. But it turned out to be a very good owner. And, he had them all the way till Dan Gilbert bought it. And I think he still owns like 15% of the team.
Right. So we're going to go back to the Browns. How was your interaction with Art Modell back in the day?
He was really good. Actually, you could call him anytime. He loved to talk. He talked way too much for an owner. Mm-hmm. Until, the word on the sale came out. And then, of course, he ran and hid. But I mean, he was very engaging. You know, Modell's was a advertising guy and media guy out of New York. And so he always figured that I'm after getting the next story. Even if I got ripped on this story, I'm after the next one. I mean, sometimes he kind of rip into you about what you wrote, but he would keep talking to you. Mm-hmm. He was engaging, but you know, what he did was despicable because I wrote a book called False Start, and it lays it out. All he had to do, he sat there for 10 years next to Al Werner. 10 years. Werner owned a small piece of the team. Flip it. Art gets the small piece. Al gets the big piece. The Browns stay here. Ozzie Newsome becomes the GM. Werner, who had the political juice to get a stadium built, would have got it built. And they would have probably won a Super Bowl here. Mm-hmm. And Art could still go around shaking hands and giving after dinner talks and having a good time. Instead of, you know, he goes to Baltimore where they literally give him a franchise and a stadium. And to show what a lousy owner he is, you know, within 4 years, he's selling part of the franchise and then he's selling the rest of it. He's the only guy that couldn't make money in the NFL. I don't get it.
Yeah, I got a little impatient there. And a little.
No, I mean, there's always something going on financially with him.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's always something. Another issue there was the money.
There's another curtain behind the curtain, and it really is on that. And I never could get to the bottom of it, other than it's an exaggeration, but not a ton. You always say if the NFL, if they never sold a ticket, very few teams actually would be going really broke because the TV money's so big and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what could have been, right, Terry? Had he not had any money issues,
and then you start from scratch, and they rushed. That was the second fastest expansion startup in NFL history. Mm-hmm. When the Browns came back in '99, it was like 9 months,
and then Cleveland Stadium was just a pit at that point too. I mean, he owned the stadium, didn't he? Try to Cleveland Stadium Corporation,
and he was trying desperately to get that thing redone instead of. It was a lot of bad, you know, he made a bunch of bad business decisions and I wanted to blame everybody else. Mm-hmm. And also he was a lot of other people's money guy too. There were other investors involved. I mean, one of the nice things about the situation now in town is, you know, Gilbert basically he has a few small investors, but he primarily owns the Cavaliers. Mm-hmm. The Dolans, you know, own the entire Indians. Now they want a minor investor, but you know, they're not owned by 15 guys. Mm-hmm. And Haslam owns the Browns, and for better or worse, but that at least keeps, allows them, I think, to be on somewhat stable financial footing, right? In terms of, I'm talking about keeping the team here, and for all the whining about the Indians now Guardians, and they don't spend any money or whatever. I mean. Last year they had a losing records. I mean, the previous 7 years they had winning records, like went to the playoffs like 4 times. I mean, my goodness, they'd be building statues in front of Brown Stadium to people if that was going on.
Yeah, totally agree. Hey, speaking of the Indians, Terry, you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when they built this thing with the, you know, Lofton, Bell, Alomar, Baerga, and they turned this franchise around, you being in Cleveland, were you aware of anyone around the team that knew that they were going to take off like that? Did you know that they were going to be able to transform like that?
Well, John Hart thought so. I remember that. You know, he's the one putting it together. Now, general managers can also be delusional at times. They think all their moves are right, but you could sort of see it coming. These were guys that were, you know, coming up through the minors, and Baseball America was rating them highly. You know, Charles Nagy, Albert Bell. You know, Lofton was a good prospect when they traded for him. Then they were able to make. I think a key trade was getting Omar Vizquel for Felix Fermin. Mm-hmm. And see what happened at that point. They're moving a new ballpark, and suddenly the Indians became like a top 10 spending team. They went up as high as 6th at one point, because back then in the 90s, your cable TV wasn't as dominant a revenue source as it is now. Your ballpark was.
Right.
So people, when that ballpark was going up, and even the first year or two, sometimes you could walk by and fans are just staring through those bars in the outfield, just looking at the ballpark,
Right.
You know, like this is the first time I've ever seen an airplane or something. I was like, they couldn't believe how nice it was.
And you look at the numbers, you know, the payroll right now and adjusted for inflation, it's like what it was in the early 90s when they were bad, right before they moved in. It's crazy how low it's got over the last several years.
And I do think it's going to go up some. But I will argue this, and John was down in Tampa. Let's just not play the payroll game.
Yeah,
You
right.
just it's not just. I mean, that's the amazing thing with the Indians. Well, they went to the playoffs, but they had the number 20th payroll. Okay, well, good. Let's have a number 5 payroll and have idiots running the team and miss the playoffs all the time.
Yeah. And you know, Terry, that's the one thing that I think fans forget about is that people can knock the Dolans for not spending a lot of money. But the one thing that they've been able to do is keep this front office in place and give them the power and let them do their business, and they do their business. And that front office is one of the best in baseball. And they've grown it organically, and look what they've been able to do. They've, developed players, they've maybe not have drafted as better, or they're drafting better now than they were 5-10 years ago, but their development in pitchers, especially, and everybody, and now hopefully now you get some position players in there, but the front office has a good eye for talent, especially in these trades that they make too. So
and they're trying to lock players in before they go to arbitration too, when they're early on.
Yeah. So I think that gets lost in unfair criticism.
They have to be doing a lot right. I mean, Terry Francona keeps signing extensions.
Right.
Chris Cincinnati keeps signing. Why? They could go. Mike Chernoff has turned down the Mets, says he's the number 2 guy. Yeah. He's turned down other teams.
Yes.
A number of years ago when he was a young executive, Chris Cincinnati turned down the Cardinals. That's a good job.
Mm-hmm.
That's
a baseball town too.
Baseball town. Mm-hmm. And it's a baseball town, with a hockey team, and that's it.
I lived in St. Louis. I went to school in St. Louis, and I remember moving out there, realizing how much it's different than Cleveland. Small town blue collar.
It's a whole regional team because there isn't much around it.
Correct.
The cable TV deal is good, and that sort of, and he thought seriously about it, but he really felt he married a lady from Cleveland, and he really felt comfortable here. And I remember Francona's told me a couple times, he called it, I could do pure baseball here. This is a guy that came out of Philadelphia and Boston before. And it isn't that, they don't expect me to win. Believe me, I mean, Francona is very competitive and all the physical problems he has. But he just feels, he always says, I can go through the hard times with these guys. And, it isn't like, and I've had this story told to me by executives from other teams. The owner comes in and says, my grandson's in a fantasy league and he picked up this guy, this pitcher. He's doing great on my grandson's fantasy team. And he's sitting there go, I actually have to answer to my owner about his grandson's pickup in a fantasy league.
That's funny.
That's hilarious.
Well, Terry, we got a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. Want to circle back around to Joe Tait. You spent a lot of time with Joe right before he passed away. He's a good friend. How was he in the final weeks, the final days? Really, I mean, you can go back in the decade where he was retired. What was his mentality and how was it when he was removed from basketball after doing it for so long?
Well, what happened there that wasn't talked about a lot, I wrote about it a few times towards the end. His wife developed Alzheimer's. So Joe was doing a lot of home health care and trying to do that. And so between doing that and the Cavaliers, then I really believe a lot of the stress led to some of the heart problems he had and that kind of stuff. He just couldn't physically do it anymore. And I think also the NBA that we talked about quite a bit here, that had kind of disappeared. It was much more of a big business than that. So he really was ready to step away. And then what happened that was a blessing for him is finally, he probably kept his wife home a couple of years longer than he should have, because I would call him and all of a sudden it's like, oh no, my wife she's wandered outside or whatever. I mean, it's really hard. And then finally he found a place that he felt that a memory care place where he could put her. And he would go then every evening to give her supper. And even though she didn't know his name or anything else like that. And so Joe actually had a couple of good years, and all of a sudden he developed cancer, and then it impacted his kidneys. But really, Joe, I mean, the last week he was still talking to me. I was going over there, and you could tell he was in pain in that, but he never lost like And one thing too, if you have anybody with dementia or Alzheimer's in your family or close to you, you start praying, oh Lord, I don't want to be that person. And, Joe never did. Really, it was only until about 36 hours before he died where he just kind of got out of it. And so I was glad about that. He was at home, and, he was just a great friend. And we always just hit it off. I mean, it's just, there were 2 stories that I wrote recently. It's like I started to actually call him forgetting he was dead. One was when Joe Tait, when Bill Fitch died, and the other was about those guys from the 70s. He would have been perfect to talk to.
You mentioned in your book too that Bill Glass was an important person in your faith journey. Can you go into that? How so?
Well, I met Glass originally when I did the Brownstown 64 book, and he had the Brown sack record for many years. And at that point, after he left football, he thought he was going to be like the next Billy Graham. He, in fact, even did some citywide ministry things with Billy Graham. But he had a friend of his who challenged him to go do jail ministry and prison ministry, which at that point also was very, very rare. You didn't have many of these ministry groups going in like now. So he started doing that. And I wrote the thing for a profile of Bill for that book. And it was interesting, but I didn't really follow up. But a couple of years later, Ronnie Kuntz, who is his son, John Kuntz, is now a photographer for the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com. Ronnie was affiliated with Bill and an outstanding Pulitzer nominee photographer. And the Indians are playing, this is in the 90s, middle 90s, are playing a big series in Chicago. And Ronnie calls me and he says, hey, why don't you come over with me? Why don't you come to Cook County Jail with me? Bill Glass is here, and I know he'd like to meet you. And so I went into the prison with them, and I thought, well, Ronnie's like, it'd be a good story, So I went in and, kind of joined their team for the day. Cook County Jail, what an armpit that is. It's downtown Chicago, really bad, hardcore guys. But I found the ministry, my faith was just beginning back then, to be really interesting, and a way to talk to people. Because see, and how it works in the prison system, if something's a volunteer activity and you go in, generally you are kind of a protected class and a respected class, unless you're a total jerk. The inmates, if they're glad to see anybody if they're allowed to pick to go. Now, these poor people who do anger management classes where the guys are required to go, they're angry about going to anger management before it even starts. So you could just imagine. I mean, it's a classic story, but it's true. And like one guy, they were sitting in their anger management thing. They handed him a book on anger management. He goes, I am tired of people telling me I'm angry. I am just so tired with some F-bombs in there. He rips up the book and just throws it up in the air and storms out. That's anger management. So, but when the volunteer, and so I really found that, and as my faith was going, and then I went on some of the other ministry things with Bill that he did. And then one of the local at Summit County Jail, they asked me to come in, and because I had written that story about Bill Glass, and it just kind of grew from there. So that was for like 20 years. I did jail ministry here at Summit County. It kind of died during COVID. Now, primarily what we do 2 or 3 times a month is my wife, Roberta, and I, and our friend Gloria Williams and our friend Steve Haley, we go into the Haven Arrest, the Akron City Mission, and we do the services before they serve their meals in the evening. And I mean, actually, a bunch of those guys I've run into over the years in jail, but I've always, it's great. You don't have to pass a collection plate. Nobody complain about parking, When I was doing jail ministry, look, if you don't like it, just go back to your cell. I mean, it's not a big deal. But I've never felt in any way in danger. I mean, there was a guy early on, I remember when I first started, and he was one of the Aryan Brotherhood guys. He had the Nazi stuff on, and he was in one of these ministry things, and he comes up to me and he says, hey, you nervous or anything? I go, yeah. He goes, you're new, right? I said, yeah. He goes, listen, don't worry about a thing. He puts his hand on my shoulder. He goes, anybody touches you volunteers, like we got an art teacher we like or whatever, anybody touches you all, we'll kill him. And you're looking at this guy going, oh, it's got those teardrop things under your eyeball. You don't get that for going to chapel,
Right.
So, but it's true. I was always glad nobody made a move towards us, because not that we would have gotten all that hurt because those other guys have been on them, but it would have been bad.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they really would have. I had what sometimes occasionally, I'd be there and a guy's kind of talking a lot, and all of a sudden two guys, man, you just shut up. Let the man talk. You come in here and there, you be disrespecting him. Guys, settle down. So they really did have your back.
Wow.
Now, if you come in and you talk down to them and put them down, you're not going to get that.
Right.
But if you've been doing it for quite a while, and I think I would say fueled by the Holy Spirit, showing the kindness, I loved it. And it's the same thing with the Haven Arrest, that it's phenomenal there to do that type of ministry. As Frank Kona talked about pure baseball, well, it's just pure ministry. I'm not saying it's always easy, but in terms of what you would think, physical danger, that's not the problem. It's just kind of a lot of guys are beat up physically and emotionally and depressed. And so it's a spiritual, emotional battle. There's a lot of the things I read about in my faith columns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty rewarding experience for you, I'm sure. Terry, one last question for you before we let you go, and we appreciate all the time you're giving us here tonight. Scott and I are kind of curious about this last question because you've been around in a lot of these teams and venues. So if you can think of these off the top of your head, just go for it. Your favorite memory in the Richfield Coliseum, Cleveland Municipal Stadium, and Cleveland Arena.
Well, Cleveland Arena, the Cavs,
even with the Rats,
or is there one?
Where there weren't any. Here's what it was: the arena that my father loved Pete Maravich, and so we would go, and for $2.50, you could buy tickets right behind the basket and watch Maravich or the Cavs anytime you wanted.
Nice.
Going with my dad with that. At the Coliseum, I remember when the Cavs knocked off Boston and they went to the Eastern Conference Finals. That was in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And that was where there's a famous sign on the way to Richfield there. And for some reason, I put up Larry Bird's last game, and it turned out to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because I was really engaged with that team in 92. That was Mark Price, Craig Ewell, Doherty, Nance, Lenny Wilkins, the coach. And it was just fun to see them come together. That's why, it took a while. They got knocked out in the first round like 3 straight times.
Right.
In the playoffs. It was difficult for them. And Progressive Field, because I'm thinking those games where they clinched like in 2016 or when they went to the World Series, those were all on the road. I mean, the best sporting event I'd ever been to, well, there's 2 of them, but they're both been on the road. One was in 95 when Dennis Martinez out-dueled Randy Johnson in the Kingdom in Seattle to go to the World Series, where Kenny Lofton scored from second base on a pass ball.
ALCS.
That was just terrific because they were just, I remember Dennis Martinez kept saying before the game, because I knew him pretty well, I'm going into the mouth of the lion. I'm going into the mouth of the lion. See, I had covered Dennis in 1979 because I had spent a year covering the Baltimore Orioles. And he was a pitcher. So I had a pretty good relationship with him. And he outdueled Randy Johnson. And then the other was in Oracle Arena in 2016 when the Cavs came back from 3-1 to win. The coolest sight there was usually we've seen opposing fans take over our venues. Like the Cubs fans took over Progressive Field in 16, and we've seen a lot of that. But in this case, I don't know how about 1,000 Cavs fans got in there. And as the Golden State fans were kind of trudging out with their heads down, we know that feeling. All of a sudden, these fans, and the Cavs are getting their trophies and they're all dancing at midcourt and the game's over. And all of a sudden, all these fans, about 1,000, ring the court and just start chanting, "Let's go Cavs, let's go Cavs." And I'm writing the story and thinking I had 18 minutes to write that story and get that thing done and in because it was a West Coast game. And I remember I kept yelled out at least 2 or 3 times. What was the score? 93-89, by the way. Usually I don't remember about that because the last thing you want to do is I'm thinking, somebody might actually want to read this. And then the phenomenal thing was we sold over 530,000 copies of that Monday paper, which people kept buying during the week because you know what they discovered? You can't put a website on the wall.
Yep. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got those framed in my house.
Yeah. Yep.
What was your favorite memory at Municipal Stadium, real quick?
Well, they were always terrible when I was there. It was my father when I was a kid. He would take me, and I was really small with this, and we'd go sometimes on the West 3rd Street Bridge, and he would pick me up and put me on his shoulders. And he could kind of see, remember the lake and the sailboats, and just being carried by my dad. I mean, I was blessed to have a father who, in my life, and that's one of the things I've learned from a lot of the years of jail ministry, and that is the lack of fathers and families. It's just devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, a lot of people have come through single family homes or great moms or grandmas taking care of them. But when you get them and kind of give them a little true sermon in their days, those women all tell you, man, we really needed a male influence.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a strong one. He was not Mr. Upbeat all the time, but he was always there and that. And he took me to games, and he did really help develop my interest in sports. So the stuff, the father-son things with that, really at those venues, like where the teams were very good. But most of the time when you talk people's memories, it isn't about, a certain game, unless it's something dramatic. It's more like just having that feeling you have with that important person in your family who took you there.
It's funny because my brother and I, our dad, same thing. I remember going to my very first Browns game, first Indians game, and I wrote about it in one of Dick Goddard's books. And I remember it vividly, going up the ramp and then seeing the stadium, Municipal, for the first time with my dad. I'll never forget that, back 40 years ago. And John's had similar memories, with my dad. So it's stuff that at the time you kind of take for granted, but as you get older, you realize how important that is.
Yeah, that ramp view is just something. As a kid, you just walk up a ramp and then boom, there's the stadium.
And the other thing that helped, especially now, I don't know when you guys were younger, but when I was, it was black and white TV. So when you would see the stadium, the grass looked gray.
Right. Yeah.
So the green the colors would just jump out at you. And remember also the lake looming out behind
mm-hmm.
the there. That was really, really, really cool.
Well, Terry, we took up way too much of your time, but the stories were fantastic. And we want to thank you for being a part of our podcast today. And we're going to put this together, and we will definitely have it online so you can check it out when it's everybody can check it out
on social media and those places. So
yeah, exactly. So Terry, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure every question we have for you today, when I go to sleep and I wake up in the morning, I'll have 3 more questions that I'll have to email you to get answered. But thank you so much. It was an honor. It was a pleasure to hear you.
I enjoyed it too.
Well, thank you again, Terry Pluto. Scott, man, he is a wealth of historical stories when it comes to the Cleveland sports scene and a lot of different facets of the teams here. We went down a long road and that forked in so many different directions. I'm glad we kind of got into a little NHL Cleveland Barons talk a little bit. I know when we were talking about doing this, I'm like, I got to get his points on the NHL thing. It's completely not on anybody's radar here, but people forget there's an NHL team here for 2 years in the 70s and why it wouldn't work really now.
And it's really fun too when he talks about being a beat writer, a sports journalist back in the good old days before social media, back in the 80s when, like he was talking, they were allowed to be at practice during Caps practice. And right after practice, they would go ahead and shoot around with the players. I mean, you would never hear of that happening today.
No,
but
you
back
wouldn't.
in the day, you were embedded within the teams.
Yeah, playing one-on-one with Steve Kerr. I mean, like,
right.
No one knew Steve Kerr was going to be a soon-to-be Hall of Fame NBA coach, but just to do that, you can still obviously go in the locker room now as reporters. With COVID, we obviously can't do that now. Hopefully, when things continue to lighten up here, we'll be back in there. But the accessibility that we had even before COVID is nowhere near what Terry Pluto had.
Oh, I know.
Nowhere near.
He was talking about that Steve Kerr story too, and didn't he? What was it? Didn't he bet him a lunch and then he finally paid up on it years later? Something like that.
Yeah, paid up on that years later, which just goes a testament to how cool of a guy Steve Kerr is. And I know us Cavs fans here hated the Warriors during those 4 years, but I equate Steve Kerr to like Mike Krzyzewski at Duke. If you don't like Duke basketball, but you like Mike Krzyzewski, you don't like the Warriors, but you like Steve Kerr because he's just a good dude. And it was cool to see him pay back that bet back in the day.
What's interesting about Terry Pluto too is that, we're all fans. He's a fan, but he's been doing it so long. He's had to learn that separation between being a fan and being a sports writer and a columnist. And part of that is, you don't get too attached. And when we asked him, do you collect any sports memorabilia? Do you have any little mementos? And he really doesn't have too many.
No,
he has a few, but not many. Surprising, but not surprising.
A lot of beat writers, just the guys that I worked with in Tampa and then obviously back here at home, are kind of like that, but maybe they'll have something around or something that is nostalgic to them. But I was surprised Terry had nothing from those early days or anything like that. So that was interesting to see. And of course, Scott, the one thing I loved talking to him about, and I think it was your question about his relationship with the late Joe Tait, who we're coming up here on the year anniversary of him passing away.
Isn't that crazy?
It is nuts. And I remember reading those articles of Joe Tait's interviews with Terry Pluto in his last days about a year ago. And March 10th, actually, you know what? It's going to be tomorrow is the day that Joe Tait passed away. So the day this podcast, the day this podcast goes live.
It's funny. I had a chance to meet him right after he retired. He came to the station, and it's when he was writing the book that he wrote, co-authored with Terry Pluto.
Yeah, Have a Ball or whatever it was called.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I remember he really didn't want to write a book. And then Terry Pluto said, hey, wait, we can do it a different way. And that's another great book you want to pick up. It's an easy read, and it's just them talk. It's almost like both of them sitting down and talking and putting it on paper. But, Joe Tait was another guy. He was a real quiet guy. And, anyway, just hearing Terry Pluto talk about him in his final days. And again, someone that we grew up with as the voice. I remember him as the voice of the Cavs and the Indians, listening to him on television.
And, Scott, one of the reasons why I got into sports broadcasting at a young age, you're partially responsible too, is because of, yes, you got into TV and I kind of followed what you did, but also because of Joe Tait.
Sure.
And I know because of time, we didn't get a chance to tell that to Terry, or to go down that road of the one time as, I was like 7 or 8 years old, Scott, when we met Joe Tait at the Richfield Coliseum, waiting throughout his post-game interview or post-game show on the radio. Mm-hmm. And we sat there and listened to the whole thing and talked to him. And ever since then, I was glued to like some type of broadcasting. And, we had we had one TV growing up in the house that had cable. Yep. And whenever the Cavs, we got booted off in favor of mom and our sisters. So if the Cavs weren't on, we got moved to the bedroom, and I listened to the Cavs games on my alarm clock radio.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Listening to Joe Tait in the bedroom. And, for all those that don't realize, Scott and I shared a room for years, and I'd play with like my action figures or my Hot Wheels cars, listen to Joe Tait, and that's
Joe Tait.
And
that's all.
It's fun.
I remember that. I was meeting Joe Tait. I still have that autograph. And of course I wouldn't have known, 20 some years later, I get to have a chance, but he was real cordial. We he's busy doing his thing, and we met him. And anyway, it's one of our stories that kind of runs in conjunction with all these Terry Pluto stories, but
definitely a legend for Joe Tait. And of course, Terry Pluto, and a wealth of knowledge. My favorite book that he's written, he's got a ton. That Vintage Cavs book was fantastic. A lot of cool stories in there too. And we touched on a little bit in that too.
And you can check out all of Terry Pluto's books too. The Vintage Cavs, Vintage Browns book are the 2 books that he just released. And he's got 30 others on sports, on faith. These books go back. And if you're just a Cleveland sports fan, you got to pick up one of his books, check it out. So I hope everybody had just a fun time listening to Terry. He could have gone on forever. It was great having him on the show. If you want to listen to any of our podcast episodes, Press Play Podcast, you can send us a message on Twitter. Me, Scott Sabol Fox, the number 8. My brother's also on Twitter. You can send a message to him on Twitter. We have a whole bunch of episodes lined up here in the next couple of weeks. And we want to thank everybody for joining us here this week.
All right. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We'll check you guys out next time.